Hi, I'm Claire. Back in high school, I used to babysit to save up for college. I wasn't new to it. Kids, routines, and bedtime tantrums didn't scare me. But one night, one family changed all of that. It started like any other gig. The Petersons, a family I'd babysat for a few times, called me to watch their two kids, Mia and Austin, while they went out for a late dinner. They lived in a big older house on the edge of town. It was charming during the day but eerie at night, with creaky floors and long hallways that seemed to stretch forever. Mrs. Peterson gave me the usual rundown when I arrived. Dinner's ready for them, just heat it up. Bedtime is 8:30. If Austin wakes up crying, just sit with him a bit. He's been having bad dreams lately, she explained. I nodded, trying to look calm even as a chill ran down my spine. Austin, barely 5, stood nearby clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. He didn't say much, just stared at me with wide, anxious eyes. By 8 o'clock, everything seemed fine. The kids were playing, the house was quiet, and I started to feel silly for being nervous. I got them ready for bed, read a quick story, and tucked them in. Mia fell asleep instantly, but Austin kept tossing and turning. "It's okay, Austin," I whispered, patting his back. "Just close your eyes and I'll be right downstairs if you need me." He nodded but didn't say a word. I went back to the living room, turned on the TV, and scrolled through my phone. About an hour passed when I heard it, faint footsteps upstairs. I paused, holding my breath, listening. Maybe Austin was up. I turned off the TV and crept upstairs. The hallway was dim, lit only by the nightlight plugged into the wall. I peeked into Austin's room. He was in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. "Austin? Are you okay?" I whispered. He didn't answer, just pointed toward the corner of his room. I turned, heart racing. The corner was empty, just a rocking chair that had always been there. It wasn't moving, but something about it felt off. "Sweetie, there's nothing there," I said, trying to sound calm. "No, she's there," Austin said finally, his voice barely audible. My throat tightened. "Who's there, Austin?" "The lady," he whispered. I froze. "What lady?" He pointed again, his little finger trembling. I backed out of the room and closed the door, telling myself it was just a kid's imagination. But when I turned to go back downstairs, I heard the faint creak of the rocking chair moving. I stopped. My whole body went cold. Slowly, I turned back and peeked through the crack in Austin's door. The chair was rocking gently back and forth, back and forth. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to grab Austin and Mia and run, but something told me not to go back in there. Instead, I rushed to Mia's room where she was still fast asleep. I locked her door and went downstairs to call the Petersons. The call went straight to voicemail. As I stood there, phone in hand, the house suddenly felt wrong, too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft humming sound like someone singing a lullaby. It was coming from Austin's room. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight, and slowly went back upstairs. The humming grew louder as I approached. I could barely breathe. When I opened Austin's door, the chair was empty. No one was there. Austin was still lying in bed, wide-eyed, but he wasn't looking at the corner anymore. He was staring at the doorway behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. That was it. I grabbed both kids, their blankets, and their favorite stuffed animals and brought them downstairs. I locked all the doors and kept them with me until the Petersons came home. When they arrived, Mrs. Peterson apologized for not answering her phone. "The reception was terrible at the restaurant," she explained. I didn't say much about what happened. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. But as I was leaving, Austin ran up to me and hugged me tight. "Thank you for keeping her away," he whispered. I asked him what he meant, but he just ran back inside. That was the last time I babysat for the Petersons. To this day, I still don't know what I experienced that night. But every time I hear a rocking chair creak, I feel that same cold chill. I still remember the first time I ever had a babysitter. I was 8 years old and my parents were going to a wedding out of town. They promised they'd be back late that night, and since it was a long drive, they thought it best to hire someone to stay with me. Her name was Miss Claire. She was probably in her early 20s with long dark hair and a smile that seemed too perfect, like it was painted on. My parents had found her through a friend of a friend, and they seemed to trust her right away. I didn't know what to think. I'd never had a babysitter before, and the idea made me a little nervous. "Don't worry, honey," Mom said as they left. "Claire's really nice. You'll have fun." The moment the door shut, her whole demeanor changed. The warm, friendly smile faded into something colder, something I can't even put into words. The first thing Claire did was set rules. "You stay in your room unless I tell you otherwise," she said, her voice flat and sharp. "No wandering around, no noise, and definitely no going into the kitchen." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. She wasn't mean exactly, but there was something about her tone that made me feel like I shouldn't argue. "Good," she said, her smile returning in a way that didn't feel right. At first, I tried to stay in my room like she said. I played with my toys and tried to focus on my coloring books, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept out to see what she was doing. The lights in the living room were off, but I could hear her muttering to herself. Peeking around the corner, I saw her sitting on the couch with a small mirror in her hand. She was whispering something, but it didn't sound like words, more like strange noises, almost like a chant. Her reflection in the mirror didn't look right. It was delayed, like it wasn't moving in sync with her. Gave me chills. I backed away quietly and went back to my room, my heart racing. Later she brought me a doll. It was old, with cracked porcelain skin and eyes that seemed too real. "This is Sarah," she said, handing it to me. "She's your friend now. Take good care of her." I didn't want to touch it, but she stared at me until I took it. The doll felt cold, almost like it had been sitting in a freezer. That night, as I lay in bed, I swore I could hear faint laughter coming from the doll. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but it was there, soft and eerie. Around midnight, I got thirsty. I knew she told me not to go into the kitchen, but I couldn't help it. I tiptoed downstairs, hoping she wouldn't hear me. The kitchen was dark, except for the faint glow of the refrigerator light. As I poured myself a glass of water, I heard something behind me. Turning around, I saw Claire standing in the doorway, her face partially hidden in the shadows. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice unnervingly calm. I was just getting water," I stammered. She stepped closer, and for a moment I thought her eyes looked different, darker, almost black. She leaned down, her face inches from mine. "I told you not to come in here." I froze, unable to move or speak. She straightened up and smiled. "Go back to bed." I ran back to my room and didn't come out again. When I woke up, the doll was sitting on my desk, even though I'd left it in the corner of the room. Its head was tilted, and its eyes seemed to follow me. When my parents got home, I ran to them, clinging to my mom and begging them not to let Claire come back. My dad asked what happened, but I couldn't explain it. How do you tell someone about strange whispers, a creepy doll, and a babysitter who seemed wrong? When they went to pay Claire, she was gone. Her purse, her coat, everything she'd brought with her, it was like she'd vanished. The only thing left behind was the doll. We never saw Claire again. My parents tried calling the friend who'd recommended her, but they claimed they didn't know anyone by that name. The doll stayed in the house for weeks, no matter where we put it, storage, the trash, even the curb. It always reappeared back in my room, sitting on the desk with that same eerie tilt of its head. Eventually we burned it. My dad threw it into the fireplace one night, and we watched as the flames consumed it. I don't think it's really gone. And I'll never forget Miss Claire, or whatever she really was. Emily Carter was a 19-year-old college student. Babysitting had been her part-time gig since high school, and she had a reputation for being trustworthy and reliable. One Friday evening, she took on a job for the Montgomerys, a wealthy family living in an old, sprawling Victorian house on the edge of town. The parents were attending a gala, leaving Emily in charge of their 6-year-old daughter Lily and their infant son Max. When Emily arrived, the house felt unnervingly quiet, despite its ornate charm. The Montgomerys gave her a quick tour, pointing out the kids' rooms, the kitchen, and the nursery at the end of a long, dim hallway upstairs. "Oh, and one thing," Mrs. Montgomery said, hesitating at the door. "Please don't go into the basement. It's old and unsafe." Emily nodded, noting the odd tension in her voice, but didn't ask questions. She'd been warned about overly cautious parents before. The first few hours were uneventful. Emily prepared dinner, read Lily a story, and settled her into bed. The baby monitor for Max worked fine, and the infant had fallen asleep easily. After tidying up, Emily settled in the living room with her psychology textbook, the soft hum of the baby monitor keeping her company. Around 10 p.m., a faint sound broke her concentration. It was static from the baby monitor. She glanced at the screen and saw Max's crib, empty. Her heart skipped a beat. She hurried upstairs, only to find him sleeping peacefully in his crib. Confused, Emily checked the monitor again. The feed showed the empty crib, though Max was clearly in it. She assumed it was a technical glitch and went back downstairs, chalking it up to old equipment. As the night wore on, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. The wooden floors creaked as though someone was walking above her. Emily checked on Lily, who was sound asleep, and then peeked in on Max, who remained undisturbed. Returning to the living room, she heard something faint yet distinct, a soft, rhythmic knocking. It seemed to come from the basement door. Her stomach tightened. She remembered Mrs. Montgomery's warning and decided to ignore it. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing minute. Unable to resist her growing anxiety, Emily approached the basement door. She hesitated before calling out, "Hello?" The knocking stopped. Emily backed away, her hands trembling, and returned to the couch, trying to focus on her book. But the silence was worse. It was heavy, suffocating, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Shortly after midnight, the baby monitor crackled to life again. This time it wasn't static. It was a whisper, soft and chilling. "Come downstairs." Emily froze, her heart pounding. She stared at the monitor, her breath shallow. The whisper repeated, more insistent this time, "Come downstairs." Gripping her phone, she dialed the Montgomerys. The call went straight to voicemail. Summoning her courage, Emily tiptoed upstairs to check on the children. Lily was still asleep, but Max's crib was empty. Panic set in as she searched the nursery, finding no trace of the baby. She ran into Lily's room, shaking her awake. "Where's Max?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lily rubbed her eyes, groggy. "He's with the lady." Emily's blood ran cold. "What lady?" "The lady from the basement," Lily mumbled before rolling over and falling back asleep. Terrified but desperate to find Max, Emily went to the basement door. She hesitated for a long moment before opening it. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of earth. Using the flashlight on her phone, she descended the creaking steps. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and dusty boxes. At the far end of the room, she saw Max's blanket draped over a chair. As she approached, a figure moved in the shadows. A woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and tangled hair. She was holding Max, cradling him gently. Emily's voice caught in her throat. "Who are you? What are you doing?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head and whispered, "He's mine now." Emily lunged forward, but the woman vanished, leaving Max's blanket to fall to the ground. She searched the basement frantically, but it was empty. Max was gone. When the Montgomerys returned, Emily told them everything, expecting anger or disbelief. Instead, their faces paled. Mrs. Montgomery began to cry, while Mr. Montgomery quietly said, "We should have warned you." They explained that the house had a history. Decades ago, a woman named Margaret had lived there. She'd lost her own child to illness and was rumored to have gone mad, taking other children from the neighborhood before vanishing without a trace. The Montgomerys had never experienced anything themselves, but Lily had often spoken of the lady in the basement. The police were called, but no trace of Max was ever found. Emily never babysat again, and the Montgomerys moved out shortly after the incident. To this day, Emily can't forget the sound of the woman's whisper or the sight of her holding Max. And sometimes, late at night, she dreams of that basement and the hollow eyes watching her from the darkness.